Hello, welcome to Technical Founders. My name is Carlos Lara, software engineer and entrepreneur, and today we'll be looking at the 10 different pivots according to the Lean Startup. So every entrepreneur faces a special challenge in developing a successful product, deciding when to pivot and when to persevere. It boils down to a seemingly simple question. Are we making sufficient progress to believe that our original strategic hypothesis is correct? Or do we need to make a major change? That change is called a pivot. A pivot is a structured course correction designed to test a new fundamental hypothesis about the product, business model, and engine of growth. So the first kind of pivot is called a zoom-in pivot. So in this type of pivot, what previously was considered a single feature in a product becomes the whole product. So a famous example is Instagram. It started out as a location-based social network that wasn't gaining much traction, but the founders realized that most of its users were using exclusively the photos and filters section of the app. So they pivoted, that became the whole product. They kept refining it after that and then sold it to Facebook for $1 billion. The next kind of pivot is called a zoom-out pivot. This would be the opposite. In this type of pivot, what was considered the whole product becomes a single feature in a much larger product. For example, if customer feedback reveals that users want more than the product currently offers, then it may be a sign that a zoom-out pivot is required. The next kind of pivot is a customer segment pivot. In this pivot, the company realizes that the product it's building solves a real problem for real customers, but they are not the types of customers that it originally intended to serve. For example, a company building an on-demand house cleaning app for married moms living in houses may realize that the people who really get value are actually single men living in apartments. So that would be an example of a customer segment pivot. The next kind of pivot is called a customer need pivot. As a result of getting to know customers really well, it sometimes becomes clear that the problem that we're trying to solve is not very important to them. However, we often discover other related problems that are important and can be solved by us. So the target customer has a problem worth solving, just not the one that was originally anticipated. A famous example is the chain Potbelly Sandwich Shop, which today has over 200 stores. It began as an antique store in 1977. The owner started to sell sandwiches as a way to get more traffic to the shop. And then they realized very soon afterwards that people were coming to the shop, to the antique shop, for the sandwiches. Then very soon they actually did a customer need pivot where they started selling sandwiches exclusively. So they changed the business itself completely by realizing that customer need in the process of building their own antique business. Very interesting. The next kind of pivot is called a platform pivot. This type of pivot refers to a change from an app to a platform or vice versa. For example, sometimes startups who want to create a new platform start out with a single app, the so-called killer app for their platform. Later, when the app has a larger amount of users, the platform emerges and then can be leveraged by third parties, for example, to sell their own products, to advertise, etc. So that would be an example of a platform pivot. The next kind of pivot is a business architecture pivot. Companies generally follow one of two major business architectures. One is high margin, low volume. So for example, B2B, companies selling to other companies, they would be selling in a low amount of volume. They wouldn't be selling that many units, but they would have a lot of profit typically per sale. And the other kind of business architectures would be low margin, high volume. And the example would be selling to consumers, a company that sells to consumers. So typically you sell a lot more of the product, but have less profit per sale, but it's still very viable. Both of them are viable. It really both architectures are viable. It really depends on the particular business and the situation. Now, in a business architecture pivot, a startup switches between these two models. So for example, a startup selling test preparation software may pivot from selling to college students to selling to universities or vice versa. So college students, for example, would be the consumers and universities are companies. So that would be an example of a business architecture pivot. The next kind of pivot is called a value capture pivot. In this type of pivot, a startup changes the way in which it captures the value that it creates. This typically refers to changing the startup's revenue model, how it makes money from the value that it creates for customers. For example, a startup that initially sells licenses for its software may decide to just give it away for free and instead collect and sell the data from its users to other companies. So the value is the same, they're creating the same value, but the way they monetize, the way they make money from this value they create for the customers has changed, and that would be an example of a value capture pivot. The next kind of pivot is called an engine of growth pivot. And as we saw in the last video, there are three primary ways in which a startup grows. One is called the sticky engine of growth, the second is called the viral engine of growth, and the third is called the paid engine of growth. Now, in this type of pivot, a startup changes its growth strategy to seek faster or more profitable growth. For example, a company that initially thought that it would grow by retaining its users may find that it grows much faster by actually paying to acquire those users and profiting from the customer lifetime value. So from the lifetime, for as long as they stay with the company, with the product or the service, the money they make. So that would be an example of pivoting from a sticky engine of growth to a paid engine of growth. So that would be an example of this kind of pivot. The next kind of pivot is called a channel pivot. Now, the mechanism a company uses to deliver its product to customers is called a sales channel or distribution channel. For example, packaged goods are sold in grocery stores, cars are sold in car dealerships, etc. It's where you're selling the product. Now, often the distribution channel itself determines the price, features, and competitive landscape of the product. So a channel pivot is a change in the channel through which we sell our product or service. For example, a startup selling its product by advertising on social media may realize that it's much more effective to use a direct sales force that calls people and persuades them. So that would be an example of a channel pivot. Again, it's the same product, but just the way the mechanism through which you're actually delivering it to your customers has changed. The last kind of pivot is called a technology pivot. Now, in this type of pivot, a startup discovers a way to achieve the same solution by using a completely different technology. For example, a startup building a native mobile app for iOS and Android separately may realize that it can achieve the same result in a fraction of the time and for a fraction of the cost by using Xamarin Forms. And from the engineering videos, we saw that with Xamarin Forms, we write the code only once in the same programming language for both platforms simultaneously. So it's very, very powerful, and that would be an example of a technology pivot. So thank you for watching. I hope you liked it. If you have any questions, any thoughts, any comments, please leave them at the bottom. Also, please subscribe. Again, I'm putting up the videos at least once a week, so you'll be the first to be notified. And again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.